All right, so question 96, here we go. It's in 6 parts. Should human law, be general or particular? Should it prohibit all vices? And remember what virtue and vice is, right? So, virtues are good qualities, vices are bad qualities. Simple enough. Does it command all virtuous acts? Does human law have an obligation in the court of conscience? Is everyone subject to it? And lastly, can we act contrary to the letter of the law? So let us go to the Zuma. So here we have powers of human law. Number 1, whether the human law should be framed for the community rather than for the individual. That's another way of saying for the general rather than particular. And I answer that. First of all, let's go to the on the contrary. In this one, the I answer that doesn't seem to give us a yes or no. It's in the on the contrary. The jurist says that laws should be made to suit the majority of instances, and they are not framed according to what may possibly happen to an individual. Therefore, yes, they should be for the general. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. Wherefore law should take the account of many things, so as to persons, as to matters, as to times, because a community of the state is composed of many persons, and its good is procured by many actions, nor is it established to endure for only a short time, but a long... So obviously, yes, it should be in the general, right? So you're not going to make a law for each individual person. Then, of course, the problem becomes, okay, if the law is general, there's going to be circumstances in which they might not apply to every individual. That's sort of ultimately where we're going. So whether human law, whether it belongs to the human law to repress all vices. So can laws take care of all bad behaviors? He says, I answer that. Law is framed as a rule or measure of human acts. Now a measure should be the same with what it measures. Wherefore laws imposed on men should also be in keeping with their condition. For, Isidore says, law should be possible both according to nature and according to the customs of a country. Now, possibility or faculty of action is due to an interior habit or disposition, since the same thing is not possible to one who has not a virtuous habit, as is possible to one who has. Thus, the same is not possible to a child as to a full-grown man, for which reason the law for children is not the same for adults, since many things are permitted to children which in an adult are punished by law, etc. In like manner, many things are permissible to men not perfect in virtue, which would be intolerable in a virtuous man. Okay, what is he talking about? So what we're after here is, right, can we repress or end all bad actions? Now notice he starts out here talking about habits and virtue and vices and all this kind of stuff. And he talks about certain virtuous dispositions, right? So are you going to stop everything? Well, you can't, right? I mean, but he's making a distinction. Some people can follow the law and have a virtuous disposition. Some people have a tough time with it, right? And so there's like two sort of levels, I guess you could say, of law, where it has to apply specifically to some people who can't hang, right? Some people who can't simply have the discipline to do what is good. Hence the distinction between, a kid and an adult. He continues. Now, human law is framed for a number of human beings, the majority of whom are not perfect in virtue, right? Wherefore, human laws do not forbid all vices from which the virtuous abstain, but only the more grievous vices, from which it's possible for the majority to abstain, and chiefly those who are to the hurt of others, without the prohibition of which human society could not be maintained. Thus, human law prohibits murder, theft, and that kind of stuff. So in other words, what? This is interesting, where he says, human laws do not forbid all vices from which the virtuous abstain, but only the more grievous vices from which it is possible for the majority to abstain. So, in other words, you put up with some vices because you're not going to be able to stop everyone from doing their thing. So, as an example, it's like you might think, you might think that drinking is a vice, right? And so you personally might say, okay, therefore, I'm just not going to drink. And so for you, it's not a big deal, right? If you're going to call that a virtuous act, you're already inclined toward that, so you're good to go. However, for the rest of us, if we like to drink, we're going to do it, right? So you're not going to stop that, but you can stop drinking and driving, right? Because that's something that could hurt someone else, as he suggests here. And chiefly those that are to the hurt of others, right? So where you're not going to be able to command all people to be virtuous because they simply aren't, right? So you do your best by coming at the things which will hurt other people and hence the community. All right. Continuing, whether human law prescribes acts of all the virtues, right? In other words, can you make it a law that all the good things have to be done? The species of virtues are distinguished by their objects, as explained above. Now, all the objects of virtues can be referred either to the private good of an individual or to the common good of the multitude. Thus, matters of fortitude may be achieved either for the safety of the state, for upholding the rights of a friend, and in like manner with other virtues. Okay, so fortitude or courage is a virtue, right? Good enough. It is a good thing, absolutely. And you can be virtuous for the common good, right? So think of, soldiers in war doing courageous things for the state versus doing courageous things for just your buddies. Okay, same virtue. One is common, one is for individual purposes. But law, as stated above, is ordained to the common good. Wherefore there is no virtue whose acts cannot be prescribed by the law. Nevertheless, human law does not prescribe concerning all acts of every virtue, but only in regard to those that are ordained to the common good. And it doesn't matter about mediate or immediate. So the question is, can human law prescribe all acts of virtue? No. Only those that are for the common good, right? So I guess that would be, and there's no specifics here, so it's like, well, what does he mean by that? I guess that could be the draft, like drafting people to fight for the state or something, would be an example of prescribing good, or Good Samaritan laws, right? Like, is it a national thing or a state thing? Where if you don't render aid to someone who's in need, you're guilty of something. I don't know what exactly it is. That's what he's talking about. Whether human law binds a man in the court of conscience. Okay, so when we're talking about conscience, right? You know what we mean. Conscience means you feel bad. So think of it like, almost like internalizing public opinion or something. So let's see. Laws framed by man are either just or unjust. Let's skip down to the deal here. It has to do with the common good. We've looked at this 100 times. For since one man is a part of the community, each man in all that he is and has belongs to the community, just as a part in all that is belongs to the whole. Wherefore nature inflicts a loss on the part in order to save the whole, so that on this account, such laws as these, which impose proportionate burdens, are just and binding in conscience and are legal laws. Right? So in other words, it's like you can enact laws that, will trouble people and you don't have to feel guilty about them. The question is, when do they become something that you should feel guilty about, right? On the other hand, laws may be unjust in two ways. First, contrary to the human good. Got that? And where does the second come in? Either respect, but rather cupidity or vainglory. Secondly, laws may be unjust. Sorry, down here. Through being opposed to the divine good. Such are the laws of tyrants inducing to idolatry or anything else contrary to the divine law. And laws of this kind must no wise be observed, because we ought to obey God rather than man. This is an important one right here. So at the end of the day, right, there are laws, and, sometimes we have to follow them without a sense of conscience, right? We follow them because, even though, we don't like to, okay, we kind of have to sometimes. But this second thing is important, because he's talking about when they become unjust. Remember, we can't follow laws that are against the common good or that are against divine law. And so this little statement right here is sort of like, at the end of the day, do you choose human laws or do you choose natural or divine laws? You choose divine laws. So idolatry is when you have to worship something else. So, you could argue, if America said that, we're going to have to worship a golden calf, and your conscience, you'd have to follow your conscience and not worship a golden calf. Well, I mean, if you're buying what Aquinas is saying, right? Because that would be against divine law. So there's that one. So yes or no? Does the human law bind man and conscience? No. You still have a conscience, and your human law sometimes jives with it, sometimes it doesn't, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to consider higher laws. Whether all are subject to the law. Now, here's the thing, right? Because we're going to say, well, some people have to do it, some don't. Well, then what's the point of the law? The first one's kind of simple. Here he talks about proconsuls and stuff. All he means is this. Sometimes we're not subject to law if we don't live in that country. Simple enough, right? So you can't be held liable for breaking Icelandic law because you're not in Iceland, right? But the second one is the one that we should spend some time thinking about. Secondly, a man is said to be subject to a law as the coerced is subject to the coercer. In this way, the virtuous and righteous are not subject to the law, but only the wicked, because coercion and violence are contrary to the will, but the will of the good is in harmony with the law, whereas the will of the wicked is discordant from it. Wherefore, in this sense, the good are not subject to the law, but only the wicked. That's kind of a weird one. Oh, wait, there was one other thing that we should have mentioned here. So, yeah, you don't have to follow what Iceland says. You also have to follow the higher law. He talks about proconsuls and that sort of thing. In Rome, the emperor was in charge, and there was a proconsul, and there was a quaestor and an aedile. So in other words, if the mayor passes a law, you don't have to follow it if it goes against what the governor of Texas. So there's levels. But this other one about the wicked and stuff is interesting. So what he's saying is, you're not subject. Subject means that you are thrown under. Think of subject in terms of, those yokes that oxen wear, if you've ever seen those pictures, like that, if I'm not mistaken, I'll have to go back and look at it. That may be the etymology of the word subject, because sub is under, eject is thrown. So you're thrown under, like yoked, like an ox. But it's interesting because what he's saying here is, if you already have a moral compass and you're not going to, you have a disposition not to do these vicious things, then you're not subject to law. It's like you're not yoked, because you already just do what is good. So you don't even have to think about not doing what is bad. Does that make sense? Because the law provides coercion and, as he says, coercion and violence, fear of punishment. But if you just follow the law because it's right, it's like you're not subject to it, you're just with it, if that makes sense. Okay, so only the wicked are actually subject to the law. And it's an interesting distinction. Lastly, whether he who is under a law may act beside the letter of the law. So here's where we go. So in other words, the letter law. In other words, are there certain times when you can kind of like not ignore a law? Well, actually, yeah, sometimes ignore a law or a piece of a law. Here's what he says. Let's pick it up about here. Since the lawgiver cannot have in view every single case, he shapes the law according to what happens most frequently by directing his attention to the common good. Wherefore, if a case arise wherein the observance of the law would be hurtful to the general welfare, it should not be observed. And then he gives an example, right, of a besieged city. Makes sense. If following the speed limit is going to make someone that you're trying to get to the hospital die, then don't follow the speed limit, right? That logic comes in there. Nevertheless, it must be noted that if the observance of the law according to the letter does not involve any sudden risk needing instant remedy, it's not competent for anyone to expound what is useful and what is not useful to the state. Those alone can do this who are in authority and who on account of such like cases have the power to dispense from laws. If, however, the peril be so sudden as not to allow the delay involving by referring the matter to authority, the mere necessity brings with it dispensation, since necessity knows no law. Bam. So it's like down here, you're leaving the gate open, you're leaving the back door open for, of course, in emergency situations, you don't have to follow the law, right? If it says do not exit here, but there's an emergency, go ahead and exit there, right? That kind of thing. But again, notice, it's not competent for everybody to expound on what is useful. So you can't just, I'm going to just do the law because I'm going to break the law because I think it's dumb. No, there has to be a compelling reason. And I think that's just kind of common sense, isn't it? Okay, so this gives us question 96, a little bit of human law. And we kind of put it together. What do we get? Well, at the end of the day, human law cannot be specified for everybody, right? And you cannot specify every good thing and deny every bad thing. And human laws will have some room for alteration, right? But also an important thing with human law is it does not supersede laws higher than it, right? So if here's human law, it has to jive with natural law. And if it doesn't, natural law will win. And really, that idea of natural law is a big deal that, Aquinas was the first to get into it. But as commerce began to increase in Europe and they needed international laws, natural law sort of became the foundation for international law. And then by the Enlightenment, everybody's talking about natural law in terms of getting rid of the king's laws. And the idea about getting rid of the king's laws is to base real laws on natural law. So it's interesting. This stuff that Thomas Aquinas is talking about is important for centuries after his death.